The river was always there, steadfast winding, whispering its way past the edge of our family's fields like an old friend that never left. I grew up watching my grandfather cup its cold water in his sunburned hands, my father casting stones across its surface with one foot planted in mud and the other in prayer. And now, decades later, it ran the same path past my own boots, feeding the same soil where I taught my daughter to plant rows of beans and corn with the same reverence. We didn't own the river, no one truly does, but it ran along the back end of my land, serving us the way it had for generations. I live in a neighborhood most folks would call peaceful, though that word can be deceptive. Briar Glen was the kind of place that looks calm in spring newsletters and PTA announcements, but scratch just beneath the surface, and you'd find the quiet rules of control. Neighbors watched each other too closely. Flags were debated, lawn heights were measured, and somewhere above all that, the HOA sat like self-appointed royalty on their cul-de-sac thrones. Still, I stayed clear of their games. I had enough on my plate running the farm and raising my daughter Eliza on my own. Ever since her mother passed 5 years ago, it's just been the two of us: sunrises, school, pickups, dinner by the porch, and weekends checking the fences or chasing down a stubborn goat. The rhythm was hard, but honest. Eliza had a way of grounding me when things threatened to spiral. She'd catch me staring off too long, thinking about how grief could sneak into the edges of a good day, and she'd crack a joke or wrap her arms around my waist like a vice. She was my reason for staying strong. Our plot sat right at the border of Briar Glen and the protected floodplain. The HOA didn't own our land, but they sure tried to act like they did. A few years back, they tried to fine me for unauthorized outbuildings, referring to my family's old barn that predated the HOA by at least 30 years. I fought them and won. Since then, I kept my head down and documented everything. I knew from experience that quiet people become easy targets for loud ones with clipboards. The river, though, was the one thing they never messed with. It was outside their jurisdiction. It crossed the far end of my property and wrapped around the backside of a stretch of HOA-maintained lots. If anything, it was our common boundary, the natural line where their meticulously landscaped backyards ended and my rows of tomatoes began. But then came Karen. Karen Walsh. Platinum hair clipboard glued to her wrist SUV that never got mud on the tires. She moved into the neighborhood about 9 months ago and within weeks was already running for HOA president. Claimed the last board was incompetent and too lax on rural encroachments, whatever that meant. She wore sunglasses, even when it rained, and called everyone by their first name, with an edge like she knew something about you that you didn't want others to know. At first, I ignored her. People like Karen usually burned out once they realized no one was clapping for their power trips, but she didn't fade. She dug in one over the board with promises of elevated property values and started sending out surveys and pamphlets about neighborhood enhancements. Then she showed up at my gate. It was a Tuesday. I was working on replacing some cracked fence posts when her Mercedes pulled up and idled just long enough to make it awkward. Eliza was down by the henhouse, humming some tune she made up, and I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked up the hill to meet our new self-declared queen. "Mr. Halstead," she said, lips tight. "Ma'am." I was hoping we could chat. HOA concerns. I opened the gate but didn't invite her in. "You're on my property now." "Of course," she said like it was quaint. "I wanted to discuss the river. The back edge of the neighborhood slopes toward it, and we've noticed some erosion, potential liability issues. It's a river. It erodes. That's what rivers do." She smiled like I'd said something idiotic. "Yes, but if we're not proactive, someone could get hurt. Children play near the back lots. Pets. We're considering a redirection effort. Gentle grading and some managed flow." I narrowed my eyes. Redirecting a river. A creek, technically. No, it's a river. I've got 60 years of floodplain maps, hydrology reports, and real-life experience that say so. She didn't like that. Her smile stayed, but her eyes cooled a few degrees. "Anyway," she said, "I just wanted to give you a courtesy heads up. The board will be reviewing proposals. It may affect the shared boundary." "There is no shared boundary," I said. "That river's mine. Your authority ends at the fence." Her smile dropped then just a fraction, but I caught it. "We'll be in touch." I watched her drive off, dust rising behind her like the warning tail of a snake. That night, Eliza asked me why I looked upset during dinner. I told her the HOA was sniffing around the river, and she rolled her eyes the way 12-year-olds do when they sense injustice. Can they do that? She asked. Not legally, but they'll try. I nodded. They always do. I stood outside that night long after she went to bed, listening to the water moving through the dark. The river had always been loyal, bending gently when it needed to, swelling in spring, retreating in drought. It was a living thing, and I knew deep in my bones that tampering with it would come at a price. Karen didn't believe in consequences yet, but she would. She'd learned the hard way that rivers don't take orders. They remember. It didn't take long. Less than 2 weeks after Karen's visit to my gate, every homeowner in Briar Glen received a glossy full-color pamphlet in the mail, complete with a drone photo of the neighborhood, a fake smiling family standing next to a little creek, and the title in bold letters: Securing Our Future Flood Mitigation and Property Safety Enhancement Plan. They really do love their titles. I stood in my kitchen reading it under the flickering light above the stove, Eliza chewing cereal at the table. Her backpack leaned against the chair, one strap broken and patched with duct tape. I'd been meaning to fix it. She looked up and saw the paper in my hand. Is that from her? Yeah. Karen's plan was laid out in neat, bullet-pointed sections. The riverbank behind lots 31 through 42, those backing up to my land, was listed as a potential hazard zone. The HOA had commissioned a private landscape consultant to recommend improvements, which included managing water flow through controlled diversion and regrading terrain for safety and drainage. Nowhere did it mention my land, or the fact that those improvements would require altering the river's natural course, shifting it deeper into my side. But I wasn't surprised. That was Karen's move: sanitize the language, drown the threats in buzzwords, and smile like she was doing everyone a favor. The pamphlet ended with a notice about a mandatory HOA board meeting to vote on moving forward. It would be held in the Briar Glen Community Clubhouse on Thursday night, open to all residents. I decided I'd go. It had been years since I set foot in that beige stucco box they called a clubhouse. The last time had been a barbecue fundraiser for the local fire department. My wife had still been alive then, balancing Eliza on her hip and laughing with the other moms. Funny how the same space could hold such different memories. Back then it smelled like ribs and cheap beer. Now it reeked of politics and Karen's perfume. The room was packed. Rows of folding chairs, most filled with the same faces I saw jogging past my fields or frowning at dandelions in their driveways. The board sat at a long table at the front, each one with a name tag and a pitcher of water. Karen stood in the center like she was addressing a courtroom. Her blazer was crisp, her hair perfect. She opened with a slide presentation about runoff risk and erosion management. Behind her, the projector flickered between aerial photos of the neighborhood and CGI mock-ups of cute little walking trails along a rerouted stream, though in every image the stream was a narrow, cartoonish ribbon bearing no resemblance to the actual river. I raised my hand. Karen paused and looked down at the attendees, trying to pretend she hadn't noticed me until now. Yes, Mr. Halstead. It's not a stream, I said, standing. It's a river. It's been a river since before this HOA was ever dreamed up. And your plan cuts directly into my property. Karen smiled tight and composed. Thank you for your comment. We've consulted professionals. Which ones? A certified landscaping engineer. Landscaping, not hydrology. Not floodplain management. Not state water control. She hesitated. The room shifted uncomfortably. I've lived on that land my entire life, I said, turning toward the neighbors. My grandfather farmed that soil. That river is the only reason our fields are fertile. You can't just move it because it makes your property line look prettier. Karen's smile cracked. We're not moving anything illegally, she said. The board is exploring options to protect our residents. You'll flood me out. That's not accurate. Do you even have a permit from the Department of Environmental Quality? A beat of silence. Karen turned back to the projector. The HOA has authority to manage common land for safety purposes. This isn't a public hearing. We'll now proceed with the board vote. 5 hands raised, all board members. None hesitated. I stood there as they passed the motion with the elegance of a firing squad. My land, my river, my legacy. Voted away with the flick of a wrist. Eliza was waiting when I got home, sitting on the porch in her pajamas, eyes wide like she could feel the storm in me before I opened my mouth. Well, she asked. They voted yes. She hugged her knees. Can they really do that? No, I said, not legally. But that won't stop them. I sat beside her and looked out at the moonlit field, the silhouettes of stalks swaying in the wind, the dark sliver of the river glinting like steel. I remembered my father's stories about how this land flooded back in the 80s, how he and his brother spent 3 days stacking sandbags to protect the barn. That river didn't play favorites. If you disrespected it, it took what it wanted. They'll come with machines, I told her softly. They'll dig trenches and build berms and call it progress. But rivers don't forget. And they sure as hell don't obey HOA boards. I knew I'd need help, real help. So the next morning I drove into town and walked into the office of a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Caleb Stenner had worked for the county's water division before starting his own environmental consulting business. He was sharp, practical, and didn't care much for politics. When I laid out what Karen was planning, he whistled low and shook his head. They didn't file for a watershed impact permit. Nope. They didn't even notify DEQ. Not a word. Then they're idiots. That gave me a sliver of hope. Caleb agreed to come take a look at the site and told me to start documenting everything: soil movement, water flow, timestamps. He handed me a waterproof notebook. They're going to try to make this look like your fault when the water turns, he said. Don't let them. I didn't plan to. Back home, I set up my trail cams. 3 of them, each pointed toward the back edge of my property, right where I suspected Karen's operation would begin. I mounted them high in the trees, disguised with brush, and sealed tight against the coming rain. Eliza helped me set the last one. She didn't ask many questions, just followed my instructions, handing me zip ties and camouflage netting like a soldier in the field. That night, I wrote down everything in Caleb's notebook: the date, the time, the smell of the wind, the faint hum of insects in the grass. The river whispered beside us, steady and strong, but I could feel the current shifting. It was a Tuesday morning when the first growl shattered the quiet. A low mechanical rumble out of place, amid the usual sounds of birdsong and the creak of wind through the oaks. I was in the barn tending to a stubborn latch on the goat pen when Eliza came running across the yard barefoot, her voice thin and sharp. "Dad, there's a bulldozer." I dropped the pliers and followed her out past the shed down the gravel path that led to the back acres. And there it was, big as sin and twice as loud, an old yellow bulldozer flanked by a small crew in neon vests and hard hats, inching its way across the backside of Lot 38, just feet from the riverbank. The land belonged to the HOA, yes, but it sat directly adjacent to mine. And what they were doing wasn't just landscaping, they were excavating. I watched in disbelief as the machine's blade cut deep into the earth, pushing up a wall of dirt and sod along the edge of their lot. Another man wielded a chainsaw, bringing down a cluster of elder trees that had stood for longer than any of their McMansions had existed. The noise rattled through my chest. I crossed the boundary line, my boots crunching over the brittle grass, and approached one of the workers. "You got a permit for this," I called over the engine's growl. The man looked up startled, then shrugged. "Talk to the supervisor." That turned out to be a lean guy in mirrored sunglasses, chewing gum like he was bored stiff. "You the landowner?" he asked, not offering his name. "It's my land they're about to flood. We're working under the HOA's directive. We got orders to redirect surface flow away from residential lots, while legal. Signed off by the board. The board's not the law." He snorted. "Don't like it. Take it up with your neighborhood council." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because behind me, 30 feet up in the cottonwood tree, my trail cam blinked red. It saw the blades dig into untouched floodplain. It saw the absence of erosion controls. It saw the total lack of posted permits. And so did I. I spent the rest of the day walking my boundary line, watching as they brought in gravel trucks, drainage piping concrete slabs. They were moving fast, as if rushing to finish before anyone could stop them. By sunset, a berm nearly 6 feet high curved like a spine across the back of the lots, angled directly toward the narrowest part of my lower field. It didn't take a hydrologist to see what they were doing. They were building a channel. Not to protect the neighborhood, but to sacrifice my land as a runoff basin. The idea was simple: if you give floodwater a place to go, even if it's someone else's, you save your own lawn. When I called Caleb that night, he didn't swear, but I could hear it in his voice. "Send me pictures, every angle. I'll pull the soil maps and check the drainage code for that lot." "You think I can stop them?" "I think if you don't document it, they'll claim it was always like that. You know how these things go." Yes, I did. Back inside, I found Eliza sitting on the floor with her sketchpad drawing a crooked version of the bulldozer, complete with a little stick figure labeled Karen in the driver's seat. She had added a frowning sun and the words "not cool" in bubble letters above the scene. "Is our farm gonna flood?" she asked too quietly. I didn't want to lie to her. I never had. But I couldn't say yes, not yet. "I'm working on it," I said. She nodded and went back to shading in the angry clouds. The next day, I drove to City Hall and filed a formal complaint with the Department of Environmental Quality. It wasn't much, just a report and a request for site inspection, but it was something. I included photos of the earthworks coordinates time-stamped images from the trail cams. I even printed out the HOA pamphlet and underlined the euphemisms they'd used to disguise their real intention. The clerk behind the glass partition stamped the forms without much interest, but I knew it was on record now. And that meant they couldn't pretend it never happened. When I got home, 2 more trucks were parked at the edge of the HOA land. One was offloading heavy-duty black piping culverts, probably. The other carried rebar cages and wooden forms. They weren't just building a berm. They were constructing a spillway. I felt a fire rise in my chest, that old pressure I hadn't felt since deployment. The sense that something was moving just out of my control, just fast enough to outrun reason. I hadn't needed that side of me in years, the calm, tactical version of myself that could see 5 steps ahead in a crisis. But that part was back now, and it was angry. I walked straight up to the crew this time and asked for the site manager. A woman stepped out of a white pickup, clipboard, aviator glasses, ponytail tight enough to lift her eyebrows. She introduced herself as Leanne, project lead from a subcontracted construction firm hired by the HOA. I asked again, "Do you have a DEQ permit?" She blinked. The HOA assured us all necessary documents were filed. "If there's a problem, you'll need to contact them." I took a long breath. "I'll be contacting more than them." She gave me a careful look, then said, "We're just doing our job," and walked away. I stood there a while after the machine shut down for the evening. The sun was dipping low, casting orange reflections off the standing water near the lowest part of my field. Already I could see how their channel would spill in the next heavy rain. And the season was just beginning. Back home, I pulled the memory cards from all 3 trail cams and backed up the footage. I sorted everything by date, marked timestamps, compiled images into a folder labeled HOA Drainage Violation. Then I printed the best shots and tucked them into a manila folder. This wasn't just for insurance anymore. This was evidence. They'd brought bulldozers to my door. I was bringing hell to theirs. The rain came fast, not the polite spring drizzle that kissed the tops of leaves and whispered through the gutters. No, this was a deluge, the kind that turned dirt to soup and sent frogs fleeing for higher ground. It came 2 days after the final segment of Karen's berm was completed, almost like the sky had been waiting for her signature on disaster. By the end of the first afternoon, the creek had already swelled to twice its size. And by morning, the lower quarter of my field, the same land my father used to call the good bed rich with black loam and perfect for squash, was underwater. I stood at the edge of the rows, boots half submerged in what used to be furrowed soil. Corn seedlings floated sideways. The irrigation hoses I'd laid by hand now trailed like dead snakes beneath the surface. I bent down and dipped my hand into the water. It was warm. Stagnant. Wrong. I'd seen this before back in 1997, when the city tried a similar redirection plan upstream and ended up flooding a municipal soccer field. But that time it had been unintentional. This was designed, engineered. The HOA had taken what was once a meandering seasonal flow and boxed it into submission, funneling its anger straight into my land. Eliza came out onto the porch arms, folded across her hoodie hair tucked up into a messy bun. "Is it bad?" she asked. I didn't answer. She looked down at her rain boots, then up again. "Dad, are we going to lose the field?" I took too long to respond. "I don't know," I said. "Not if I can help it." But that wasn't true. I'd already lost it. And the HOA knew it, too. Later that day, I found a bright orange notice zip-tied to my gate. Not from the city, not from the county, but from the HOA itself. Official citation: property in violation of Section 6A, standing water mosquito breeding risk. They had the nerve. I tore it down and crumpled it in my fist. My hand shook so hard, I nearly dropped my phone, pulling it from my pocket. I snapped photos of the soaked field, the flooded furrows, the orange citation hanging limp from the gatepost. The hypocrisy was staggering. Create the problem, then find me for it. It was HOA Warfare 101. By evening, I'd heard from two other neighbors. One had a flooded flower bed, the other a backed-up storm drain. But unlike me, their damages were minor, and they'd received friendly courtesy calls from the board rather than citations. I was the target, the scapegoat. The field meant nothing to them. It was just a convenient place to bleed off their runoff. And if they could crush me with legal notices in the process, even better. So I pushed back. That night, I sent Caleb every photo and every video clip I had. He reviewed the footage frame by frame, pointing out the exact moment the HOA's hired contractors breached the natural water channel. We matched the timestamps with weather data and satellite images. It all told the same story. They'd built a redirection trench without state approval, diverted stormwater onto private land, and violated at least 3 local ordinances in the process. But paperwork alone wouldn't stop the flooding. The next few days were hell. The rain didn't let up. It came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes, with the fury of 100 fists pounding the rooftop. And with each cycle, the field sank deeper. Frogs croaked where squash should have grown. Mosquitoes bloomed in clouds that bit through denim. The earth beneath my boots made that awful slurping sound every time I stepped. I tried to dig emergency runoff trenches, channels to steer the excess water back toward the original river bend, but Karen had anticipated that too. The new berm cut me off, like a wall, her wall. It wrapped around the rear of the HOA lots like a dam, forcing water to pool against my side, with nowhere to go. On the 4th day, I returned from town to find another notice nailed to my front gate. Failure to comply with standing water mitigation, $750 fine, second violation. They were building a case, trying to make it look like I was the problem, like my land was poorly managed, hazardous, uncared for. They wanted to fabricate a narrative where I was the negligent landowner polluting their pristine community. I knew what came next. A lien. They'd start stacking the fines, one after another. Then they'd claim my nuisance field lowered property values, and before long they'd push for legal intervention. I'd seen it happen to an old friend 3 counties over. His pond overflowed after an HOA drainage pipe rerouted water his way. They cited him, sued him, and by the time it was over, he'd lost the house he was born in. But I wasn't going down like that. Not quietly, not politely. The next morning I called DEQ. I'd already submitted the complaint, but now I demanded escalation. I spoke with a woman named Angela, who had the voice of someone tired of bureaucratic stall tactics but still believed in the job. She promised to send an inspector within the week. I also called a lawyer. Civil litigation wasn't cheap, but I had a reserve money my wife and I had saved for Eliza's college. I didn't want to touch it, but if I lost this land, there wouldn't be a future left to plan for anyway. You need a paper trail, the lawyer told me. Keep everything. Every fine. Every notice. Record your phone calls if state law allows. And don't retaliate. That's what they want. I was learning fast. The HOA wasn't just playing dirty, they were playing chess. Each move calculated, with Karen placing her pieces where she knew it would take me weeks to undo the damage. She probably assumed I'd fold. Most do. But I had 2 things she didn't. Time. And a memory. Because rivers, like farmers, remember everything. Every drop that fell. Every inch that shifted. Every trespass. And sooner or later, nature would answer for both of us. The envelope came by courier. Not regular mail. Not taped to my fence like the others. This one was hand-delivered by a clean-shaven man in a blazer too neat for this muddy stretch of the world, who looked down at my boots like they were a personal offense. He didn't say a word, just handed me the envelope and turned back to his spotless black SUV, the HOA's insignia printed discreetly on the window decal. I stood at the edge of the porch for a moment, fingers running over the thick paper. It wasn't the kind of thing you needed to open to know what it contained, but I opened it anyway. The first page began with a firm notice of cease and desist, and below that, in language that danced around logic and stomped on truth, Karen accused me of willful and negligent water mismanagement, obstruction of approved flood mitigation infrastructure and environmental conditions, posing a risk to community health. I laughed, out loud, bitter and sharp. They were accusing me of flooding them. They had redirected the river, dammed the runoff onto my property, turned my crops into a swamp, and now somehow I was the one threatening them. The second page warned of pending legal action, civil damages, HOA bylaw violations, potential county-level enforcement. And then came the kicker, a demand that I remove unauthorized trenches and drainage alterations from my property. They meant the shallow ditches I dug to try to save my field. The ones that never even reached the original creek path because they had blocked it with their berm. They were treating my survival efforts as sabotage. I sat down on the porch steps, elbows on my knees, that letter crumpled in one hand, staring out at what used to be my farm. The edges of the field still held water, stagnant and brown, curling around the edges of the rows like bruises that wouldn't heal. A few crows picked at drowned stalks. Karen was trying to force me into retreat, not just from the land, but from the fight. Turn the tables, flip the script, and hope that my bank account, my patience, or my sanity would give out before hers did. But I had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. Later that afternoon, I scanned the letter and sent it to both Caleb and my attorney. Caleb replied first. They're playing offense. That means they know they're vulnerable. We push harder. He had a plan, and it started with bringing in a state-certified floodplain engineer. Someone licensed, documented, and legally recognized by the very system Karen was trying to manipulate. Someone who could look at the land, the water lines, the equipment used, and state in words that mattered in court that the HOA had altered natural flow without permission or permits. The next day, a gray-haired woman named May Gunderson stepped onto my land in steel-toed boots and a windbreaker. She had a drone in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Your neighbor Karen, she asked with a smirk. She's not my neighbor, I replied. She's the dam builder. May chuckled and set to work. For 6 hours, she walked the length of my property and the HOA berm, stopping often to make notes, shoot photos, and collect elevation readings. She flew the drone in slow passes over both sides of the boundary line. By sundown, she had enough to fill a folder 2 inches thick. They're screwed, she said flatly. She explained how the berm exceeded the allowable slope grade, how no silt fences or runoff controls had been installed, how the water flow redirected during a high rain event violated state drainage statutes by spilling onto a known private property parcel. She even found evidence that the culvert installed by the HOA had been placed inside a designated riparian buffer strictly prohibited without a state permit. I'll have a full report in 48 hours, she said. If this goes to court, you won't be the one who's nervous. That night, I ate dinner with Eliza at the kitchen table the first time in weeks, where the tension didn't feel like a noose around my ribs. She passed me a bowl of overcooked rice and asked, "Do we have to leave?" I paused, spoon halfway to my mouth. What do you mean? Some kids at school said, if your land gets condemned, they'll move us. That the HOA can make us sell. My stomach turned. Not from the food, but from how deep this battle had already reached into her world. Even in her classroom, even in her friend group, Karen's shadow loomed. No one's making us leave, I said, steady and clear. This is our home. No HOA, no board, no bulldozer gets to decide that. She nodded, but her shoulders didn't drop. She was old enough to understand that promises don't always hold even from a parent, especially from a parent. I stayed up that night rereading the cease and desist letter over and over, parsing each line, like I was back in the field reviewing a classified intel brief. That instinct hadn't left me. I'd led recon teams through hostile terrain, built maps of enemy movement in sand and sweat. Karen was no different. She was just another strategist, relying on pressure and confusion to force a retreat. But she'd made a tactical error. She underestimated how far I was willing to go to defend what was mine. Because while she was bluffing with threats and citations, I had evidence. I had data. And I had the river. The next morning, I met with my lawyer in person. We drafted a response to the cease and desist, calm, factual, and backed by law. It outlined the illegal redirection of stormwater, the absence of state permits, and the existence of photographic and video documentation. It ended with a simple warning, and any further attempt to manipulate or misrepresent the hydrological impact of HOA alterations will be met with a formal civil lawsuit and immediate filing with state environmental authorities. We sent it certified mail. And because I knew Karen couldn't resist poking the bear, I made sure she received a copy hand-delivered just like hers had been. 2 days later, I saw her standing at the edge of the berm arms, folded sunglasses gleaming like mirrors. Her mouth was set in a line tight and thin. She was watching the field, watching the water, watching her plan unravel. She didn't wave. I didn't either, because now it wasn't just personal. It was war, and the river had just begun to rise. I didn't tell Eliza what I was doing when I brought home the extra cameras. She saw the boxes stacked on the kitchen table, 5 of them brand new, motion-activated waterproof infrared, and didn't ask a thing. She just set down her school bag, took a granola bar from the cabinet, and sat beside me while I tested batteries and formatted memory cards like it was just another routine chore on the farm. But it wasn't routine, not anymore. This wasn't about watching deer or catching the neighbor's dog wandering onto the back pasture. It was surveillance, now evidence gathering. Because the way Karen was playing the game, I needed eyes in every direction. The cease and desist had been her first big bluff, but the look on her face when she stood by the berm told me something else was coming. Something worse. So I prepared. That night, after Eliza went to bed, I moved through the perimeter with my headlamp on red light blending into the shadows the way I used to during recon missions. It was all muscle memory, placement angles, coverage, overlap. I picked 6 key locations, 2 overlooking the berm and the drainage trench, 1 deep in the cottonwoods facing upstream, another hidden near the culvert outlet, and 2 more facing outward along my fence line, in case they tried something unexpected. Each one was labeled, logged, and tested. And for good measure, I installed a 7th, hidden in plain sight, bolted to the inside of the old birdhouse on the edge of the property line. Its lens pointed squarely at the spot where HOA contractors had begun laying what looked like reinforced gravel pads. The following day, the machines returned. Same company, same neon vests, only this time, they didn't wave when I walked outside. They kept their eyes down, helmets low. One of them set up a plastic sign that read, "Caution, drainage infrastructure maintenance in progress." Maintenance. As if this had all been here before. As if I was the anomaly, and their berm, their culvert, their entire soil-churning operation was just routine neighborhood upkeep. I stood on my side of the fence, arms folded just far enough away to be legal, but close enough to let them feel my presence. One of them glanced at me nervously and whispered something to the man holding the blueprint. That man looked up and shook his head. Good, I thought. Let them sweat. By sundown, I had 3 more hours of footage, time-stamped, geotagged, with clear evidence of work extending beyond their original claims. They weren't just rerouting water anymore. They were building a pressure wall, a system designed to hold and channel runoff until it could be dumped at full force into the lowest point of the floodplain. My floodplain. I sent the footage to Caleb. A few hours later, he called back, his voice tight. "They're reinforcing a rapid-release drainage mechanism," he said. "That's not for erosion control. That's for redirection. High volume. Illegal. Very." He explained that under state law, any man-made modification of a natural watercourse that increases flood risk to adjacent property owners was not only a civil violation, it could carry criminal negligence charges if damage occurred, especially if the work was undocumented, unpermitted, and deliberately concealed. Which it is, I said, and which your cameras just proved. It was the first time in weeks I felt something like control slipping back into my hands. But I didn't stop there. I logged every weather pattern from the past month, downloaded satellite imagery, collected soil samples with the help of a local university extension program, and had them analyzed for moisture content and drainage absorption rates. My case wasn't going to rest on anger or outrage. It was going to rest on science, on documentation, and on letting Karen and her board bury themselves in their own lies. Still, I waited, because I knew Karen. She wouldn't stop unless she believed she had already won. That's how people like her moved fast, loud, and blindly confident. And that confidence made them sloppy. So I kept quiet. I let them build. I let them stake new pink flags into the earth like they were planting some twisted flag of conquest. I let their contractor install a new junction box that accidentally crossed 2 feet into my land. And I let Karen pretend I was backing down. Because the truth was, I wasn't backing down. I was loading the chamber. Eliza watched it all unfold from the house. Sometimes she'd stand by the window with a glass of juice and squint out across the field like she was trying to solve a puzzle older than her years. Once she asked, "Why don't you just tell them to stop?" I smiled. Would they listen? No. Exactly. She paused, then asked, "Will we win?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. How do you know? Because rivers always win. People try to control them, straighten them, force them into boxes. But rivers remember. And eventually they take back what's theirs. She nodded. I like that. In the nights that followed, the rain returned. Not in torrents, not yet, but steady. A drumbeat against the roof, slow and patient. The kind of rain that built itself quietly into something bigger. The creek began to swell again. The water pressed harder against the berm, and the land started to shift beneath the HOA's carefully laid gravel. I knew what was coming. But more importantly, I knew that they didn't. Karen still walked her dog along the upper sidewalk like she owned the view. She still waved to her board members and sent out her HOA newsletters with smiley emojis and passive-aggressive reminders about community compliance. But the water didn't care about newsletters, and neither did I. On the morning of the sixth rain, I reviewed the footage. The birdhouse camera had caught something new. A small crack forming at the base of the berm where the pressure culvert met the angled spill slope. It had widened overnight, not by much, maybe half an inch, but it was enough. Nature was waking up. And Karen, for all her plans, her bluster, her paper threats, had no idea how loud water could scream when it finally broke free. The forecast said it would be light. Just a passing front, they claimed enough to water the lawns, cool the air, maybe leave a rainbow or two for good measure. The weather app on my phone showed nothing worse than scattered showers, maybe a thunderclap over the ridge, if things drifted east. But I knew better. You learn to smell rain when you've worked land your whole life. You learn to feel the heaviness in your bones before it ever touches your skin. And that morning, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, unmoving, too warm for October. A yellow-gray haze hung over the valley like a curtain waiting to fall. Birds were silent. Even the goats stayed near the barn, unnerved by something they couldn't name. By noon, the sky had turned the color of bruised metal. I was tightening the last of the tarp covers over the feed bins when the first wind hit, not a breeze, not a warning, but a full-body shove that rattled the windows and sent dry leaves skittering across the yard like mice. The front had arrived early, and it brought more than rain. It brought wrath. Within the hour, the clouds cracked open and water began to pour, not fall, not trickle, pour. Like the sky itself had ruptured. I stood under the eaves of the barn jacket, zipped to the chin boots, already soaked, watching the storm drench everything it touched. The field disappeared in a curtain of gray. The treetops writhed and twisted their branches, clawing at the wind. And the river rose. Fast. Too fast. I ran to the rear fence, with a flashlight in hand, ducking low beneath the rails as the water line surged over its banks. The channel Karen's contractors had built the berm, the culvert. The engineered slope was already under stress. I could see the water backing up against the reinforced wall, looking for any weakness. The dirt at the base trembled under the pressure, tiny rivulets carving snake paths down its sides. Then I heard it. A crack. Not loud, but deep, like something ancient giving way. I turned toward the birdhouse camera, still fixed on the berm, and knew it was capturing every second. Somewhere behind me, my other cams were blinking red, recording the chaos unfolding in real time. The rain intensified. I could barely see 5 feet ahead now. Wind whipped the flashlight beam into a jittery blur. I dropped to one knee near the edge of my field, the ground already soggy enough to suck at my boots, and I watched the berm begin to buckle. The trench they had built, what they called a controlled runoff path, was now a torrent. The water, redirected and enraged, struck the base of the berm like a battering ram. Mud exploded outward in plumes. Segments of gravel and concrete broke away in chunks. The flow surged left, then right, seeking escape. And then it found it. With a sound like tearing fabric and splintering wood, the lower edge of the berm gave out. Not in a graceful breach, but a total collapse. Water roared through the opening, not into my field this time, but backward. Veering sharply east as the redirected current, now amplified by nature's full force, surged across the HOA boundary. The river, confused and furious, took the path of least resistance. That path led straight into Karen's neighborhood. Lot 36 was the first to go, water breaching the manicured slope, tearing through the ornamental hedges, and smashing through a flimsy cedar fence. From there, it spread like a living thing, crashing into backyard patios, rushing beneath gazebos, slamming against basement doors. I ran to the truck half blind, fumbling for my phone. It was already buzzing. "Caleb, you seeing this?" he asked, breathless. "It's happening now. Jesus, your cams caught the collapse. I'm watching the live feed. Get it backed up, all of it. I'm already on it." By the time I got the engine started, the road behind the barn was a creek. I skidded out onto the main gravel drive, tires fishtailing as I rounded the bend toward the HOA cul-de-sac. Even through the blur of the rain, I could see figures standing in driveways, stunned, some shouting, some filming on their phones, others just staring. And there, standing barefoot in ankle-deep water at the edge of her porch, was Karen. Her arms were spread out, palms up, like she could command the river to stop. Her white blouse was soaked through, plastered against her frame, her blonde bob limp and wild. She was screaming not words, just raw, guttural sound at no one and everyone all at once. A patio umbrella floated past her. A lawn chair overturned in the current and tumbled down the sidewalk like a toy. I pulled the truck to a stop at the edge of the street, left the engine running. I didn't get out. Just rolled the window down slightly and stared. She saw me. Our eyes locked. And for the first time since she'd ever uttered my name, she looked small. Not powerful. Not smug. Just small. Drenched, defeated, and afraid. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The river was doing the talking now. The HOA board scrambled over the next few hours trying to salvage what they could. I saw a man trying to push water back with a snow shovel. Someone else tried to plug the breach with trash bags filled with sand, but it was pointless. The system they built wasn't meant for this kind of water, because it was never supposed to hold water. It was meant to push it away. And it had done exactly that until nature had enough. By nightfall, emergency crews were on site. The county had closed off the entrance to Briar Glen. News vans showed up by morning. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Karen's house was half flooded. The back patio collapsed into a sinkhole, forming at the berm's foundation. And me, I waited. I let the storm pass. I let the cameras finish recording. I let the emails stack up in my inbox. Then I gathered my files, videos, timestamps, photos, expert reports. And I got ready to speak. Because now finally someone would be listening. They tried to say it was an act of God. That was the first line of defense from the HOA weather, beyond their control, unprecedented rainfall, faulty municipal drainage. It was all said in that cool professional tone that people use when they know they're lying, but need to sound like they aren't. A tone Karen had mastered. But God didn't build the berm. God didn't dig the trench. And God damn sure didn't reroute a river across protected land without permits. The collapse of the structure hadn't just flooded a few lawns. It had cracked the very foundation of Karen's home. Literally. Her pristine two-story colonial, with its spotless vinyl siding and grand front porch, was now slanted like a crooked crown at the top of what had become a slow-deepening pit. It started with the yard. Chunks of sod fell away one at a time, tugged by the water that had saturated the earth beneath. The flagstone path she loved so much, the one she'd posted in the HOA newsletter with captions like, "A touch of timeless elegance," broke in half and vanished into the swirling mud. Then came the porch. Eliza and I were standing at the edge of the boundary that morning, joined by Caleb and two inspectors from the county. I had a clipboard in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. Eliza held my phone recording. We were far enough away to be safe, but close enough to see. Karen stood on her porch in a bathrobe, cell phone clenched white-knuckled to her ear, yelling at whoever was unfortunate enough to answer her call. And then, before any of us could react, the earth beneath her front steps let go. The porch sagged with a groan. Wood split, nails popped. For a second, she just stood there dumbstruck, as if disbelief might hold gravity in place. And then the boards cracked, and Karen dropped her legs, disappearing through the gap, her scream sharp and shrill as the porch swallowed her halfway. "Oh my God," Eliza whispered. I took 2 steps forward instinctively, but Caleb grabbed my arm. "She's fine," he said. "Look, she's pulling herself up." Sure enough, Karen scrambled like a soaked rat, dragging herself back onto the warped boards as water gushed up through the splintered holes below. Her robe was covered in mud. Her hair hung limp and dripping across her face. But what was most noticeable, what none of us could look away from, was the panic. Real panic. The kind that comes when you realize you're not in control anymore. That all the permits you faked, the reports you ignored, the lives you tried to steamroll, none of them can save you when the ground literally falls out from under your feet. Paramedics came shortly after. She wasn't injured, not seriously. Just bruised and soaked and screaming for her lawyer. But the neighborhood had seen it. The HOA board had seen it, and by noon, so had the news. Flash flood swallows, HOA president's home community questions, unauthorized earthworks. That was the headline on the evening report. The footage came from a neighbor's security camera. You could clearly see Karen sinking her arms, flailing her mouth open wide, mid-scream. I won't lie, I watched it more than once. But not out of cruelty, out of justice. Because that scream wasn't just about her house. It was the scream of realization. That all the power she'd hoarded, all the fake authority she'd projected had been nothing more than paper armor, and water doesn't care about paper. The next day, the county sent surveyors. DEQ sent 2 senior officers with clipboards, badges, and that quiet air of people who deal with disasters for a living. One of them interviewed me for nearly 2 hours, asked about the berm, the timeline, the equipment used. I showed them everything, the cams, the photos, the timestamps. Caleb backed me up with soil data and drone footage. The best part, I didn't even have to say much. The footage spoke for itself. It showed the contractors operating beyond the property line. It showed trench work extending over the easement and into protected zones. It showed the berm cracking under pressure. And it showed Karen walking the site herself 2 days before the collapse, pointing and directing workers with that same smug smirk she wore the day she called my field a marsh problem. I turned it all in. Every file, every image, every note. And then I waited. The HOA panicked. Not just Karen, the entire board. Suddenly, they were the ones sending emails requesting urgent discussion offering to mediate the conflict and explore restoration partnerships. They wanted to sit down. They wanted to talk. But that was over. They hadn't wanted to talk when they sent the first citation. They hadn't wanted to talk when they built their damn dam. And they sure as hell hadn't wanted to talk when they tried to bury me in legal threats while my crops drowned under their runoff. So now, they could talk to my lawyer. Karen, meanwhile, had gone silent. She stopped showing up to board meetings, stopped walking her dog. Her car sat parked at an odd angle. In the driveway, one tire slightly flat, the bumper caked with dried mud. Word was she'd filed a claim with her insurance company, but they weren't paying out because the damage was caused by unauthorized structural modification and negligent water redirection. Her words, used against her. Fitting, really. But here's what stuck with me most: she never apologized. Not once. Not even when she was being pulled from her collapsing porch. Not when she was surrounded by cameras. Not when inspectors announced a formal investigation into the HOA's handling of community drainage projects. Not even when she looked up and saw me watching her from across the waterlogged mess she had created. She didn't say sorry. Because people like Karen don't say sorry. They double down. They deflect. They pretend the mud on their hands came from someone else's field. But the river knew. The land knew. And so did everyone else. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and for the first time in years, I planned to attend. Not as a protester, but as a witness. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of accountability. The courtroom smelled like old paper and cold coffee. The kind of scent that settles into the walls of government buildings and never quite leaves like history hanging in the air. I sat on the wooden bench in my best shirt, and the same boots I'd worn the day Karen's berm collapsed. They were clean now, but still scuffed. I wanted them that way. Eliza sat beside me, hands in her lap, quiet but not scared. She had grown in the last few months, not just in height, but in presence. She didn't fidget like she used to. She didn't ask if everything would be okay. She just showed up, like she belonged there, like we both did. My lawyer, Marla, sat on my other side, flipping through the binder we'd assembled: witness statements, time-stamped photos, satellite images, engineering reports, and most importantly, the footage. The videos taken by my trail cameras, the hidden one inside the birdhouse, the drone shots Caleb captured, all of it neatly arranged in a digital presentation ready to project onto the courtroom screen. Across the aisle sat Karen. She looked different now. Thinner, less polished. Her signature platinum bob was dull and flat, and the tailored blazers had been replaced by a charcoal gray cardigan that looked 2 sizes too big. Her lawyer, a stiff man in a navy suit with too much gel in his hair, whispered to her constantly. She didn't respond much. She kept her eyes down. The judge entered. Everyone stood. And just like that, the story became evidence. The opening statements were exactly what you'd expect. The HOA's attorney tried to paint Karen as a civic-minded leader acting in the best interest of the community. He blamed the storm, the outdated municipal drainage system. He even cited climate change, as if that somehow absolved the HOA of building an illegal berm that redirected a river. Then it was our turn. Marla didn't raise her voice once. She didn't have to. She clicked the remote, and the first video played silent footage of the bulldozer arriving unannounced, carving into the soft soil without a single permit posted. Frame by frame, she walked the court through the construction of the berm, the trench cut across the back of HOA lots, and the narrowing of the natural floodway that had existed for generations. Then came the footage from the birdhouse cam. Karen pointing. Karen directing. Karen ignoring the flags marking my property line as workers moved past them. The judge leaned forward. Karen's lawyer objected, claimed it was invasive surveillance, but Marla was ready. She held up a printed copy of the state statute proving that recording on one's own land, even with adjacent property visible, was not only legal, it was protected. Next came May's expert report. The courtroom watched as May herself, called to the stand, explained in calm, precise language how the berm had failed due to poor design, no runoff relief, and a complete disregard for soil conditions and water pressure thresholds. She used phrases like reckless construction, flagrant permit violations, and high-risk redirection without hydrological assessment. The HOA board squirmed in their seats. And then came the kicker. The video of the collapse, the rain slamming down, the berm cracking, the trench overloading, and then Karen's backyard succumbing to the very river she'd tried to bend to her will. Her porch disappearing. Her scream. It was powerful, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. The court saw the before, the during, and the aftermath all in irrefutable sequence. When Karen was called to testify, she hesitated. Marla leaned toward me and whispered, "She won't speak, not under oath." And she didn't. Her lawyer declined the opportunity. I, on the other hand, took the stand. I told the story, not with fire, not with blame, but with calm, brutal honesty. I explained how my grandfather had taught me the patterns of the river, how my wife and I had rebuilt the irrigation system together before cancer took her, how my daughter planted squash with her small fingers in the very field that had been drowned. I spoke of the first notices, the bulldozers, the storm, and how it wasn't nature that betrayed me, but people. At one point, I looked across the courtroom and met Karen's eyes. She didn't look away, but she didn't look sorry either. That's when I knew this wasn't about changing her. It was about stopping her. The judge called for recess before closing arguments. Outside in the hallway, lined with gray tile and vending machines, Eliza hugged me. "You did it," she said. "Not yet," I answered, "but we're close." When we returned to court the next day, the judge delivered his ruling. He didn't mince words. The HOA was found liable for property damage, unlawful water diversion, and negligence in community infrastructure planning. Karen was held personally accountable for overstepping the scope of authority, failure to seek proper permits, and malicious disregard for environmental compliance. The HOA was ordered to pay full restitution for damage to my field, including crop loss and restoration costs, dismantle the berm and restore the river's original flow under state supervision, cover all legal fees related to the lawsuit, hold new elections for the board under external audit. Karen was removed from the board, effective immediately, and fined personally for civil violations. She left the courtroom without speaking to anyone, just the clack of her ruined heels echoing across the marble floor. But what mattered most wasn't the fines or the victory. It was the recognition, the validation. For so long it felt like I was shouting into the wind, watching my land drown, while people with power smiled behind walls and waved paperwork like shields. But now the truth was written in the record, and the river would be free again. It took months for the earth to remember itself. Even after the court ruling, after the cameras were gone and the news trucks moved on to fresher disasters, the damage lingered like a bruise beneath the surface. The field didn't dry overnight. The scars cut by Karen's trench took time to heal. But nature, stubborn, slow, and steady, always finds a way back. And so did we. The crew sent by the state came first. Surveyors, soil scientists, environmental recovery specialists. They didn't wear suits or carry clipboards like the HOA's parade of consultants had. They wore boots, gloves, and patience. They walked the length of the berm with reverence, as if listening to what the land was trying to say. They dug carefully, unspooling the layers of man-made interference that had strangled the flow of the river. They broke up the concrete pads, hauled out the gravel, tore down the rebar skeletons of what Karen had built. And when it was done, they stood back and let the water speak. It came quietly at first, a trickle, a gleam of silver curling over a softened bank, dancing around the exposed roots of the cottonwoods. Then it grew. Slowly, confidently, the river wound itself back into its old bed, like a dog returning to the place it had always slept. By the third week, it was flowing true, clear, strong, and unafraid. Eliza and I stood on the bank the morning it crested its natural curve again. She didn't say anything at first, just picked up a flat stone and skipped it once, twice, 3 times across the surface. Then she turned to me. "Can we plant again?" I nodded. "We will." The soil still needed work. The roots had been shocked by standing water. But it was no longer dead. The scent of it had changed, richer, fuller. Like it remembered what it was meant for. And I knew then we wouldn't just recover. We'd rebuild better. Not just for ourselves, but for others too. I converted the old equipment shed into something new, a learning barn. A place for local kids to come and see how rivers work, how food grows, how land can be respected instead of controlled. With Caleb's help, we got a small grant to start a community restoration program. On weekends, volunteers came out to plant native grasses along the banks, build bird boxes, and paint signs about floodplain ecology. Even some of the old HOA residents showed up quietly, sheepishly, with gloves in their pockets and apologies tucked between awkward small talk. They didn't say much, but their hands moved steadily, shoveling, lifting, tending. And I let them. Because this land wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. Karen, as far as I heard, moved away. Not right away, but eventually. Her house, though salvaged, never quite felt right again. Mold set into the foundation. Buyers backed out. She stopped coming to meetings, stopped sending emails, stopped pretending. I didn't celebrate her fall. I didn't need to. The land had already spoken louder than I ever could. One morning, months after the final ruling, I found a note tucked into my mailbox. No envelope. Just a scrap of paper folded in half. It read, "Well, you were right about the river, K." I held it for a long time. Then I burned it. Not out of anger, out of closure. We planted squash that spring. Eliza chose the seeds' 3 heirloom varieties with names I couldn't pronounce. She painted little signs for each row, complete with doodles of smiling vegetables and wobbly arrows pointing to where the sun rose. Watching her press the seeds into the earth, I felt something crack open in my chest. A space that had been held tight for too long. Hope. Not the kind you whisper when you're desperate, but the kind you carry quietly, stubbornly, like a seed pocketed in winter, waiting. The last time it rained, I didn't panic. I stood on the porch with my coffee, watching the drops ripple across the field, listening to the river as it swelled and moved, not in rage but in rhythm. It no longer threatened us. It lived with us, around us, through us. It had found its way home, just like we had. And every time I hear it now, that gentle hush and pull, I remember. You can't force the river. You can't silence the truth. You can try. But eventually, everything returns to where it belongs.